Who is it that selects our leaders? You know, when I was back in grade school, of course, I was taught that we, the people, select them, right? As we participate in the American democratic process. But then I got to college and I started hearing more complicated answers to that. My government professor railed against the influence of wealthy elites in society, and then I heard others who talked about shadowy forces and conspiracies behind elections. But you know, the Bible gives us a simpler answer. Apostle Paul wrote these words to Christians in Rome. In Romans 13, verses 1 through 2, just listen, he says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." Now, what's interesting about that is at the time that Paul wrote that, Nero had probably just become emperor of Rome. The previous emperor, Claudius, married Nero's mother, Agrippina, when Nero was just 11. And Agrippina was politically shrewd. Even though Claudius had other biological children, she convinced him to adopt Nero as his successor. And so by the time Nero reached 16, Claudius began to have second thoughts. But he conveniently died at that point from some sort of poison. And Nero assumed the throne. In time, he proved himself to be a tyrant who didn't hesitate to assassinate his opponents. He probably orchestrated the burning of Rome. And then, to direct attention, he wanted to rebuild the city the way that he wanted it. And then to deflect attention from himself, he blamed Christians and viciously persecuted them. But if you believe Paul's words, then you have to conclude that God chose Nero and worked through him. If we believe in the sovereignty of God, he worked through him to accomplish his own good purpose, even through Nero's evil behavior. So though we may not perceive it, God is present and active in the selection of every leader, regardless of the various human forces at work, whatever they are. Now, that doesn't mean that he approves of their actions, far from it, but it does mean that the behavior of leaders and the ways that we relate to them are fundamental spiritual issues that affect our relationship with God. So he's there with us in the midst of all those struggles. So, as I say, today we come to chapters 3 and 4 in the book of Isaiah. And here he addresses the challenges of leadership, or we might also call them temptations of leadership. He's really continuing the message that he began back in chapter 2, where he saw two visions of the future. He foresaw first a time when Jerusalem would rise to worldwide prominence, ushering in a time of great peace. But then he also foresaw the humbling of people's pride through a terrifying display of God's judgment. And so you may remember at the end of chapter 2, he concludes with this practical application. He says, "Stop regarding man in whose nostrils is breath, for of what account is he?" So chapters 3 and 4 just continue that. He's expanding upon that lesson. And so Isaiah identifies 6 leadership challenges that I think reflect our relationship with God. Now, of course, he's addressing the people of Judah. Right? That was Israel's southern kingdom when they were divided, and they were a theocracy, right? In the Mosaic Law, God gave them clear instructions about how their leaders were to function and how people were to relate to them. But I think these challenges that we're going to see in this passage apply to other contexts as well, because they tie back to our fundamental view of authority. And so you'll encounter these challenges these temptations in the relationships between citizens and secular government, between employees and their bosses, between students and teachers, children and parents, and even church members and spiritual leaders. And so we all need to consider how we respond to these challenges. Now, the first one is what I'm calling opportunism. And that's to raise the question, what do you do when no one's watching? You know, the old saying, when the cat's away, the mice will play, right? And we really see that kind of borne out in human behavior. Because when someone in authority is present, we tend to act differently than when they're not in the room, right? We're tempted to seize that opportunity when they're away, to see how much we can get away with. So that's what I mean by opportunism. And the challenge of this when it comes to leadership is it reveals whether we're genuinely following a leader or we're just putting on a show, right? So Isaiah foresees a time when God's going to test the opportunistic impulses of the citizens of Judah. So Isaiah 3, verses 1 through 3, there he says, "For behold, the Lord God of hosts is taking away from Jerusalem and Judah support and supply, all support of bread and all support of water, the mighty man and the soldier, the judge and the prophet, the diviner and the elder, the captain of 50 and the man of rank, the counselor and the skillful magician and the expert in charms." So in other words, there's going to be a time of scarcity and God's going to strip away all their leaders. Now what's interesting is he doesn't mention like the highest leaders. He doesn't mention the king or the chief priest, though they would probably be included. But what he does is he highlights the influential sort of people that the average citizen might know and interact with. Right? The mighty men were the war heroes of the past. The soldiers were the ones who were fighting present-day battles. The judges enforced God's law. The prophets proclaimed it. But then he mentions diviners. Now that's a negative influence from false religion. Not a positive one like the others. Now, every town would have their elders to provide social leadership, and then military leadership is mentioned again with captains of just 50, right? That's a small unit. Men of rank and counselors, he's talking about people who just provide positive direction in society. But then he turns to magicians and experts in charms. So again, false religion, negative influences that were forbidden by the law. And his points, they're all going to be gone. Right? They're all going to be taken away. Now, that's exactly what happens when the Babylonian Empire attacks Judah about a century after Isaiah's time. Because they come in and they decimate the crops as they lay siege to Jerusalem, and then they exile the royal family and the nobility, including, that's part of the story of the prophet Daniel and the prophet Ezekiel, because they're sent away to Babylon. And so how do the people of Judah respond? This is the test, right? Well, here in verses 4 and 5, the Lord tells us what's going to happen. He says, "I will make boys their princes, and infants shall rule over them, and the people will oppress one another. Everyone his fellow, and everyone his neighbor. The youth will be insolent to the elder, and the despised to the honorable." And so with this immature, inept leadership, a state of anarchy ensues. People will oppress one another. They'll just exhibit this general rebellious attitude. They'll take that opportunity to get away with whatever they can. But see, they're making a foolish assumption. When people do that, when we think opportunistically, there's a fundamental flaw in our thinking. Because you think no one sees that the authority is out of the room. Right? But that's wrong. Because God is still there, right? He is ever-present, all-knowing. He is the ultimate authority. our behavior. He sees everything we do. And so our behavior in the absence of human leaders demonstrates really if we're opportunistic, it demonstrates our disregard for God himself. And that's what he's seeing here in the people of Judah. That's what he says will happen. And so that challenges us. How do we respond to the challenge, the temptation of opportunism? What do you do when no one's watching? Right? On the road with your taxes, that sort of thing. Or any other setting. We have to remember that God himself is the ultimate authority. That he's always with us. Well, that leads to a second challenge, and it's the challenge of desperation. When times are good, when life is easy, I think we feel freedom to be selective. We set high standards, rigorous criteria. We refuse to settle for anything less. But when times become hard, when we feel threatened, then we're tempted to abandon those principles and just follow our impulses. Right? In the midst of crises, we often fail to exercise discernment about who it is we're following, or about the claims that they're making. See, that's the challenge of desperation. Now, you can imagine with the scenario we just talked about in the first 5 verses of Isaiah 3, you can understand why the people of Judah would feel desperate, right? But they respond, in verse 6, it tells us they respond in a way that just seems utterly ridiculous. Here's what it says. For a man will take hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, you have a cloak, you shall be our leader, and this heap of ruins shall be under your rule. Right? You catch what he's saying? Just the fact that the guy has a cloak is like a mark of success when the city's lying in ruins. And this man isn't trying to lead. He's not seeking it. He doesn't want it. But people are trying to force it upon him. They're willing to follow anyone who might help them get ahead, who might help them get some food and clothing. But we keep reading, and the truth is this guy doesn't want the job. He says, in that day he'll speak out saying, I will not be a healer. In my house there's neither bread nor cloak. You shall not make me leader of the people. So, in one sense, it kind of sounds like a cowardly response, right? But at least he's honest. Right? A lot of people aren't. And the thing is, when we are emotionally stirred up, when we feel a sense of desperation, then people can easily come along and exploit that. Right? Now, we'll return to that thought in a moment because it comes up here again in the chapter. But for now, we need to ask ourselves, should we ever feel desperate as those who believe in the Lord? Right? Are human leaders really the ones who are in control, who provide food and clothing? What about the Lord? Isn't he with us? Why wouldn't we look to him and trust him? Remember, Matthew 6:26 tells us, Jesus said, look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And then down in verse 30 he says, but if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Are you feeling desperate about something in life, in society? I think a lot of people do. Who are you willing to follow? How quick are you to set aside your standards? When we feel that sense of desperation, we need to look to the Lord. We need to hold firmly to the truth of his word, to trust him and follow him. The third challenge that comes out as we keep walking through these chapters is the challenge of defiance. Have you ever seen a ski jumper who falls on landing. It's a terrible sight. I don't know if you remember the old ABC Wide World of Sport. It always began to talk about the agony of defeat, and they show this poor guy just tumbling. And that's how it is. They build up so much momentum going down the slope that they just can't stop. And they just keep tumbling. And I think Defiance is sort of like that. It's a steep slope. And it's like we're always perched on the edge of it. Will we follow our leaders, or will we defy them in some way? And if we step out that way in defying them, we'll gain momentum, and it's destructive, and it's almost impossible to recover. So the people of Judah and Jerusalem, they were on that sort of slope. And the Lord was revealing here that they were going to fall hard in a future crisis. But most of them still wouldn't repent. Right? They wouldn't get the point or learn the lesson. If we look to verses 8 and 9, he says, "For Jerusalem has stumbled and Judah has fallen because their speech and their deeds are against the Lord, defying his glorious presence. For the look on their faces bears witness against them. They proclaim their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to them, for they have brought evil on themselves." See, that's just a great description that shows how defiance can gain momentum in someone's life. Now, it's interesting here. He's been talking about human leaders, right? But he turns aside to focus directly on how people relate to the Lord here. And I think the idea is that defiance has a tendency to sort of color all our relationships once we give into it. And it starts, we see it there, he says, because their speech, right? It starts with speech. It's easy to talk tough, right? To say big things, particularly in our world with social media and things like that. And so once you kind of get into that habit, then something hard comes along, and in a moment of frustration, your next step is to do the same thing toward God, right? To speak out toward him, to question, to defy him. And if you don't experience any immediate consequences right away, there's no lightning bolt coming down, then you begin to act on that defiance. Right? And before long, you grow proud of it. Right? That's what he's talking about. You proclaim your sin rather than hiding it. That attitude is more offensive to God than the action itself. Right? I mean, that's what led him to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. It wasn't just the sin present in the city, but the attitude that characterized the sin. And Paul talks about it too. In Romans 1, he places it at the pinnacle of his description of human depravity. He gets all the way through the chapter, all these things, all these sins. And then he says, though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Right? It's that attitude. And let's be honest, when your whole society is heading down that slope, it is hard to resist. But Isaiah offers these words of encouragement in verses 10 and 11. He says, "Tell the righteous that it shall be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their deeds. Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for what his hands have dealt out shall be done to him." Now what's interesting here is God, in the Old Testament, he relates to the people of Judah, to Israel, collectively as a nation. But this statement shows the importance of individual spirituality, that even in that collective group, that some would be righteous and some would be wicked, and that there'll be judgment. Right? So even if everyone is adopting a defiant attitude, you can choose to trust and obey God. Now, that doesn't necessarily preserve society, right? Sooner or later, the wheels come off, society comes crashing down, either through just temporal circumstances or God's ultimate judgment. One way or the other, you can be sure it's going to happen. But the Lord always preserves the righteous. Good or bad, we reap what we sow. And so you may, in some sense, be hurtling down that slope, but if you repent and humbly turn to the Lord, He'll rescue you. The next challenge, the fourth one, is what I'm calling appetite. We go back to Genesis 3, right? And we learn that the first sin involved eating. I mean, the serpent enticed the woman with other more complicated desires too. But on its most basic level, his appeal was to her appetite, that if you eat this, you'll feel more satisfied with life. And I think that same reasoning becomes this challenge and temptation to anyone who exercises leadership. Will you serve people, or will you take advantage of them for your own satisfaction and gain? And so Isaiah warns the people of Judah here that their leaders have succumbed to that temptation. In verse 12, he says this: "My people, infants are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, your guides mislead you, and they have swallowed up the course of your paths." So clearly the leading people of Judah were not following the Lord. Now, when Isaiah, I don't think he was speaking of infants in a literal sense, and we could say the same about the passage we read earlier. The term here refers to men behaving in foolish, childish ways. And so in the absence of mature men, women were ruling, if not formally, then through exercising strong influence. And if you go back in Israel's history, God worked through godly women like Deborah to keep the nation on track when male leaders failed to step up. But in this case, we'll see in a moment that the women of Isaiah's time were not demonstrating that sort of character. The nation's leaders as a whole were misleading people, oppressing them, exploiting them, swallowing up their lives, is how Isaiah puts it. And such behavior doesn't go unnoticed, does it? The Lord says that He will ultimately address it. I think this is talking about the final judgment. If we look at verses 13 through 15 here, it says, "The Lord has taken His place to contend. He stands to judge peoples. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders and princes of His people. It is you who've devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people? By grinding the face of the poor, declares the Lord God of hosts." So leaders may be able to hide their self-gratifying ways from the people they lead, but God is present, right? He sees, He knows. And when He grants someone authority, He holds them responsible. Right? He wants them to reflect His care for people. Right? To whatever degree we have authority, we're to be like Christ, who, it says in Philippians 2, though He was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied Himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, He humbled Himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. How are you using whatever authority you have? Right? Is it just for personal satisfaction? Or do you have a heart to serve? A heart to be like Christ? The fifth challenge that comes out in the passage is what I'm calling image. Back in the days before digital cameras, it was really hard to get good pictures. You could shoot a full roll of film and have every shot out of focus and poorly lit, right? And not realize it until you paid to get it developed. But of course, that began to change with digital cameras. right? It got even easier with cameras on our phones. And now everyone can take good pictures. And not only that, but share them immediately, right? On social media, things like that. But there's a temptation there, isn't there? I mean, it tempts us to become obsessed with our image. How do I look? What will people think? All those questions. And of course, that's not anything new, right? Digital cameras, social media didn't create that. People have always been obsessed with image, even before there were film cameras, particularly the world's influential people. And so the Lord here exposes that in the leading women of Jerusalem during Isaiah's time. He begins in verses 16 through 17 of Isaiah 3, and he says this. It tells us, the Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks, glancing wantonly with their eyes, mincing along as they go, tinkling with their feet, therefore the Lord will strike with a scab the heads of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will lay bare their secret parts. But the idea is they wanted to be the center of attention. And they sought it in every way, how they walked, the looks they gave. And yet their arrogance was going to be punished. And here again, this may be talking about the time when Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians. That they would be physically wounded and exposed. And some people say that this passage, the daughters of Zion, is maybe just a personification of the nation as a whole. But there's so many details here that really do seem to refer to a specific group of wealthy leading women. If we move on to verses 18 through 23, the Lord lists all the fashionable things that sort of consumed and occupied their focus. He says, in that day, the Lord will take away the finery of the anklets, the headbands, and the crescents, the pendants, the bracelets, and the scarves, the headdresses, the armlets, the sashes, the perfume boxes, and the amulets. It keeps going. The signet rings and nose rings, the festal robes, the mantles, the cloaks, and the handbags, the mirrors, the linen garments, the turbans, and the veils. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with most of those things, although it does mention crescents and amulets, which may have been connected with idolatry, with false religion. But what really stands out here is just the size of this list, the magnitude of it. Because it shows that these women were just obsessed with fashion and image, just like a lot of people today, right? And yet hard times were coming upon them. We keep reading verse 24. It says, instead of perfume, there will be rottenness. Instead of a belt, a rope. And instead of well-set hair, baldness. And instead of a rich robe, a skirt of sackcloth. And branding instead of beauty. Now, a few of the terms there suggest perhaps he's talking about them ending up as slaves. Right? That might be why they have a rope around their waist. Might be why they're branded like cattle. And yet the irony is that in a sense they were already enslaved by their possessions, right? But once those things are stripped away, their true character is revealed. And you think, what kind of influence were those ladies having in their society? Not a good one. So if we read down verses 25 and 26, and then verse 1 of chapter 4, it shows their desperate condition in another way. It says, your men shall fall by the sword, and your mighty men in battle. And her gates shall lament and mourn empty. She shall sit on the ground. And 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread, wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach. So you would think that such humbling circumstances would correct their perspective. But that doesn't seem to be what's happening here. They're pursuing marriage because of their image. They want their reproach taken away. Right? Their main concern through it all is still about what people will think. When they should have focused on God's opinion, right, all along. That's why we look into the New Testament, 1 Peter 3:4. Peter instructed Christian women. He said, let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. So where's your focus? Are you caught up in pursuing a certain image, right? I mean, that just doesn't just apply to women. Right? Men we have our own ways of doing that. It's all about, are we obsessed with impressing people? Is that how the Lord wants us to use our influence? We have to remember that he's with us, that we have to live to please him. And then one more challenge, number 6, is the challenge of patience. Growth takes time. Of course, some plants take weeks and months, but trees take years, even decades. And of all people, those who lead should maintain a long-term perspective. But that's often not the case. Right? Leaders can be some of the most impatient and demanding people, particularly when they're not seeing the results that they want, and they may switch course quickly. Right? So patience is a perpetual challenge for both for leaders and for those who follow them. And so as Isaiah concludes chapter 4 here, he looks ahead to the future of Zion, just as he did back at the beginning of chapter 2. And so here in Isaiah 4:2, he says, in that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel. Now, it's not immediately clear what he means here by the branch of the Lord. I mean, just to look at this verse, he could be speaking about Israel as a whole, as a nation being planted in the promised land by God. But when you keep reading in Isaiah, when you get to chapter 11, verse 1, it says, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And of course, Jesse was the father of King David. Right? And so when Isaiah talks about this branch of the Lord, he's talking about a future Davidic king. And at the point that he's talking about, once the Babylonians conquer Judah, the royal line may seem like a dead stump, right? But what he's looking at is at some point this new sprout is going to spring forth. Of course, the New Testament connects that with Jesus, that he's the promised Messiah, the descendant of David, who will rule. And there's this great contrast here from the false beauty of the daughters of Zion to the true beauty and glory that'll come to the world when Christ reigns. Right? Because he'll usher in a time of genuine fruitfulness that'll fill the hearts of the people who remain in his kingdom with the right kind of pride and honor. And his kingdom will be different in 2 major ways. First, the citizens of the kingdom will be holy. In verses 3-4, Isaiah tells us this. He who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy. Everyone who's been recorded for life in Jerusalem. When the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the bloodstains of Jerusalem from its midst by a spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning. So you get the idea. Some people will enter this kingdom and some will not. Those who do enter have been recorded for life there. It seems similar to the idea that we find over in the book of Revelation, where it talks about in Revelation 13, the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. Right? And it says that the people's names were written in it before the foundation of the world. They're made holy, cleansed through his sacrificial death. But those who aren't cleansed, like it mentions the daughters of Zion here, will be cleared away through the burning of judgment. And then the first difference is the holiness of the people. And then the second is that God will be present in this future kingdom. It's the way that he's present. We look at verses 5 and 6 here. Isaiah says, "Then the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day and smoke and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory there will be a canopy. There will be a booth for shade by day from the heat and for a refuge and a shelter from the storm and rain." In other words, God will be visibly present as he was in the time of the Exodus. That he'll gather his people together and surround them with his glory. That they'll know true comfort, shade from the heat and shelter from the storm. But that time hasn't yet come, right? And that's the challenge, being patient. Are you willing to believe? Are you willing to hope and wait? Because if you're just expecting leaders here and now to bring about something like that, they can't do it. Right? And we shouldn't settle for anything less. Fix our hope on the branch who will bear true fruit. So your response to these 6 challenges of leadership reveals your heart toward God, right? And your belief in whether he really is present with us. Right? Opportunism, desperation show that we really don't believe that he's present or all-knowing. Defiance just says that we don't care, right, whether he exists or not. When we focus on appetite and image, it just reveals our selfishness. So we have to exercise patience, looking forward to the future kingdom of God. Are you willing to trust him with your future? Because if so, then you need to trust him here and now in the present. To begin to follow Christ as your leader, to confess your sins, to be reconciled with him through his gift of salvation. Right? Let his word set the course for your life. If you want to learn more about following him and some of these same dynamics, I think we see a lot of this over in the New Testament in 1 Peter chapter 2. That's a good passage to read. If you are a believer, do you need to change somehow the way that you relate to authority? Because it seems to me that a lot of Christians today are going down that slope of being pretty defiant and disrespectful. Right? As misdirected, as off-kilter as worldly leaders may be, our sovereign God has placed them over us. Right? Defiance is not a healthy attitude. And perhaps you are personally facing a difficult situation with some kind of authority figure. Are you willing to entrust that situation to God, to still strive to walk humbly in a way that shows respect for authority but stays true to God and his word? May the humility of Christ characterize us.